Okay, welcome, my friends. We find ourselves on Yud Gimel Amid B's on 13b. And again, just as things go, as you know, my laptop is a little bit wonky. I have it right in front of me this time, so hopefully you'll hear me well. But don't hesitate. It's already. Is it already not working? Do you hear me? Okay, good. Baruch Hashem. Okay, we're good so far. But if anything does happen, don't hesitate because it doesn't help if I talk and no one's listening. I mean, I like doing chazara myself, but I'm here to help. I'm here for all of us to learn together. So, okay, we find ourselves when you go on based on 13b. Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Shmuel. It's about a quarter way down. I'd venture to say it's at the end of the first section, Art Scroll. Probably still on the first page in Art Scroll toward the end, I would imagine. Did I get it? There we go. Okay, Lonnie confirms. Thank you. So, well, there's a bunch of Amar Rabbi Abbas before, but it's the final one, I do believe. Or no, second last one. Okay, you'll see what I mean. Amar Rabbi Abba Amar Shmuel. Yerakos sha'amru chachamim adam yotze behen yidei chavasa bepesach. So if you remember, we talked about this last time. Just for those joining us again, we're on Yud Gimel and Beis on 13b, quarter way down. So last time we talked about how the Mishnah tells us that there are 5 different types of vegetables that qualify as maror. Now, what's unique about these vegetables, other than them qualifying as maror, is that they happen to be, when they dry off, they disintegrate, they flake away very fast. They're very flimsy in that respect. So there's a few halachic ramifications, a few nafkaminas based on the characteristics of these vegetables. And as you guessed it, it will be important for Hilchos Sukkah. So let's see what they are. By the way, heads up, we're going to be talking a lot about the laws of Tumah and Tahara tonight. So I just want to, I don't want to scare you, but I want to let you know that most of the Gemara we're going to be doing tonight, I had to read over a bunch of times because it's one of those things where it's going to have like a really long question and it's going to say, well, maybe you think this, maybe you think that, to finally build up to get to an answer. You know, those long-winded questions. We got one of those tonight. So I'm going to do my best to explain, but just manage your expectations. It's not like when we were in Megillah and we had a lot of story time some nights. This is the one that you're going to have to hold cup for, as they say. So, but we're not there yet. So, what are the halakha ramifications? So, okay, so So what's interesting is you lose both ways. So, as we probably have discussed in the past, or maybe you've heard elsewhere, when it comes to tumas mace, if you have even a piece from a cadaver, and it's under the same roof as something else, so that tuma will transfer to anything that is under the same roof, tumas ohel. So these vegetables are able to serve as an ohel for these purposes, but at the same time, even though they are enough to serve as an ohel to transfer tuma, they're not enough to block tuma from going anything that is on top of it. It won't interpose. So it's basically, it has the downsides both ways. Either way, it's either going to transfer tuma and it's also not going to stop tuma from being transferred. And then for our purposes, the most important halacha, uposna besuk mishum avir, it's going to be treated like a gap of air in the sukkah. Now, Rashi points this out, we'll talk about this more later on, that there's a difference between when you have pasul schach versus just no schach at all. When you have pasul schach, so Rashi says, you don't have to find in the middle of Rashi, but it's at the end of Dibra Maskal, uposam besuk mishum avir, he says, uschach pasul ino posel ela ba'arba tvachim be'emsa. If you have pasul schach in the middle of your sukkah, it has to be 4 tfachim to invalidate the sukkah. And if it's on the side of the sukkah, you get up to arba amos min hatzad. That's a few feet over there you got already. You got like about 6 feet over there. So that's when it's covered, but it's covered with pasul schach. As long as the majority schach is kosher, that will be fine. The issue is that for a gap of air, even just 3 handbreadths is enough already to invalidate the schach. So this is a major chumrah over here that we're treating these vegetables. Now, even though there's a bit of 2 opinions in Rashi, and Tosas talks about it, there's a discussion whether they are inherently possible for schach, meaning do we treat them as actual food that are susceptible to becoming tameh? But even if they're inherently possible and can't be treated as schach, they're still possible schach. So they still shouldn't be invalidated with 3 tefachim. They should get at least 4 tefachim. So the Gemara answers, my time up. So the answer is that because the moment they dry up, they will eventually wither away and flake off. It's like they're not even there for our purposes. Now, I think there's a bit of a discussion whether this is probably a psul on a d'Rabbanan, it would seem like. It's probably a d'Rabbanan psul, but the Rabbanan are basically saying we're nidon al shem sofo. We look at the end and see that it's not going to last through Sukkah. It's going to disintegrate at some point. So therefore, we treat it like it's a gap of air. We treat it like it's already not there. End of that teaching from Rabbi Abba in the name of Shmuel. Let me pause. Anything I can clarify?
Good question.
Oh, yes.
So in the whole notion of 3 tefachim makes it the schach is no longer kasher. What if the wind moves it during Yontif?
Mm-hmm. So you mean Yontif?
I assume we can't go up there and fix it.
First 2 days of Sukkot, right?
Yeah, I assume we can't go up there and fix it.
Right. So if your Sukkot puzzle, that's where Amir La'akim comes in, and you could ask a guy to go and to repair, and then on Chol Moed itself, you could go fix it yourself. But that's we'd have a guy come and help if it actually invalidated your sukkah. Okay, very good. Good question. Good to get some of the practicals in, especially with sukkahs coming up. So that's good to keep in mind. Okay, this next section we're going to do is actually the last section for tonight, which means it's a very long section. Right? That was part 1. Now part 2. And part 2 takes us all the way to 5 wide lines into Yudalid Amud Aleph. So a little bit of introduction is in order. This is something that actually I don't think is too complicated to comprehend in its most simplest abstract form. So food, as we've established time and time again, even though it grows from the ground, it can't be used for schach because it is susceptible to becoming tameh. It's makabel tama, and that's a big no-no for schach. So the question is, what happens when you have vines attached to grapes, or when you have sheaves attached to an ear of grain? So even though the sheaves or the vines or the branches, whatever you may call them, are not inherently they're not the edible part of the stalk, but perhaps they're what we call yados, which are handles. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a handle to something which is makabel tuma. So do we say the same way the thing is holding is makabel tuma? Do we also say the yados? Do we treat the branches that are attached as that as well? And by the way, it goes the opposite, which we're going to discuss. Let's say you have the sheaves. So you specifically want the stalk, and I hope I'm using the right technical terms over here. If you want to use the stalk of that sheaf for schach, the ear that's on there, that has the kernels, that has what will become the grain, the food, that you don't want because that's makabel tuma. So interestingly, the question is going to be the opposite when it comes to, let's say, stalk of grain in terms of sukkah, where you actually want specifically the non-edible part. Would we say the edible part that's still hanging on would be considered yados and also would be makabel tuma, and then you have to worry about it being batal barov, that it's nullified in the majority. So that's really the general idea. And then what we're going to also discuss in the Gemara is what happens when you initially cut something for the purpose of using it for food, but then you change your mind and say, oh, no, actually, I want to use it for schach instead. So is it possible, and if so, how, that I could initially have something classified as food and thereby susceptible to becoming tameh, but then later on I could change my mind and say, you know what, I'd rather the food be used for schach, so therefore it's no longer classified as food, and therefore it's no longer it's not makabel tuma, it's kosher. So can I just do that on the whim? Do I need to do a maisa, an action? So these are the different kinds of considerations that are going to come up in the Gemara. Let me pause for a moment. Is anything in just that general introduction that I can make sure it's clearer? Because if we have a good handle, oh, that was good. That's terrible. If we have a good handle on this, we'll have a good handle on the flow of the Gemara, I do believe. I made that one up on the spot. I am proud and horrified at myself at the same time. Okay. I was talking to a fellow rabbi the other day, and we had a chakira. We weren't sure whether these kind of jokes, are they rabbi humor or dad humor or both? What's the distinction between rabbi humor and dad humor? I'm sure there's a whole shiur that we could give on that topic. Okay. Without any further ado, let's jump into the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rav Huna. So I'm going to just ask, by the way, if there's a clarification question, please ask it. But if there is just an additional supplemental idea you want to share, I'd love to hear it. But the flow of the Gemara is very essential. I don't want to lose the train of thought for my benefit and for your benefit. So it's one of those Gemaras. Okay, here we go. Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rav Huna, Abotza Legat Ein Lo Yados. So someone who is basically bringing the grapes and wants to thresh them for the juices and for the wine. So there are no issue of yados in that case. Ravanasha, right? So the reason there presumably is because we're going to explain the Gemara. You want the grapes. You don't want the vines. You specifically don't want the vines because the vines are going to be sucking up all the wine. Ravanasha Bargata Amar Rav Huna. The second opinion, we're going to see it's a little bit of a different case. Hakotzer lischak, someone who is chopping wheat in the field and wants to use the sheaves. If I forget, the sheaves are the part without the ears on it, right? The stalk, sheaf. What's the difference? You know what I'm talking about, right? Okay, the stringy part. Okay, so you want to use that part for skach. Lo yados. You don't have to worry about the ear of the grain being considered yados. So it would seem that while they both sound like they're saying the same thing, they actually, because they're addressing two different cases, they're really not in agreement. Because when we think about it, in the first case with the grapes, you want the grapes, you don't want the vines. In the second case, you want the sheaves, you don't want the ears, which is the food. So there's actually a little bit of a discrepancy between these two opinions. Madamar kotzer kol shekain botzer delo nichale delo nimsei lechamre. So the first Madamar, the Madamar who said, the second one actually, that kotzer, that when you're chopping those sheaves and you want to use them for your skach, and there's no issue of yados there, so too, kal v'chomer, when it comes to botzer, certainly there's no issue of yados, because as we explained, you specifically don't want any vines or extra sediments in there, because they're just going to absorb the wine, the precious wine that you want to extract. Whereas, so according to the second Manda Amar, which is Rav Menashe Bar Gada, Rav Menashe Bar Gada says, basically it sounds like there's no issue of yados across the board in both of these cases. However, Manda Amar Botzer, She'ein lo yados. So the first opinion we saw, which is Rabbi Abba in the name of Rav Huna, he says that when it comes to the case of grapes, there's no issue of yados, because again, you want the grapes, you don't want the vines. Avo kotzer yesh lo yados. But when it comes to the case of chopping down those sheaves of wheat to use them for skach, there actually will be an issue of yados. The ears of grain will be yados. Why? Because you actually want to have those ears of grain on there still. You want the kernels to weigh it down. Because what's going to keep all those sheaves from falling off is the fact that you have the ears on the end weighing it down. So in that case, since the ears actually have a functional purpose, therefore that would be an example of yados. So it sounds like, according to the first opinion, Rabbi Abba Amar Rav Huna says that there's yados in some cases here, in the case of kotzer, of the grain, but not in the case of the grape that you want for the food. Whereas Rabbi Menashe Bar Gada says no issue of yados in both cases across the board. We look at what primarily you are using. So that is the basic machlokis between them. However, we're now going to bring to our attention that there's a machlokis tanaim generations before that seem to have the same debate, And it would seem that Rabbi Abba is going to be forced to take a side in a machlokes Tanoim, whereas Ramanasha, we're going to try to prove, could actually play both sides in the machlokes. So what's this machlokes? Name of Ramanasha Vargada Tanaihi. So maybe for Ramanasha Vargada, he has to take a side in the machlokes. The Tanya. Sochi to Einem Mehen Tehenim. Karchilin Mehen Anavin. Kashim Mehen Shigon. Mechadus Mehen Tamar. Basically, all these examples of different kinds of, whether it's about, what are the examples? We have figs, we have grapes, we have grain, we have dates. So all of these different kinds of examples of produce that have their branches / vines attached to them. So with their stems. So kulan, the first opinion of the chachamim, kulam impesolos merubal ochlan kesher and lapsula. All you simply need is for the non-edible part of the grape / grain / whatever, that there needs to be more of that than the edible part. That's all you need in order for it to be kosher for skach. However, that's not sufficient. Aju koshim merubin al hayados al ha'ochle. So it would seem, according to Acherim, it's not enough that the non-edible part is greater in quantity than the edible part, but it also needs to be greater quantitatively than the yados. So essentially, he's saying is there's the edible part, there's the initial part of the stem that's attached to the food that we call the yados, and then there's the rest of the vine. So as long as the rest of the vine or the branches outweighs quantitatively, outnumbers the rest of the food and its yados, then the skach is okay. So it sounds like from this machlokes Tanaim that the Tanakama, the Chachamim, say there is no issue of yados, and Achirim say that when it comes to using grain to cover your sukkah, there is an issue of yados. It sounds like the same machlokes that we had before. So Rabbi Abba vade tonight. So according to Rabbi Abba, the first opinion, who said that there is yados, he said definitively there is an issue of yados when you want to use grain to cover your sukkah. You want to use the sheaves of grain to cover your sukkah. So he seems to automatically have to take the side of the second opinion of Acherim, which says that there is an issue of yados. He is not able. He's basically just copying or adopting the opinion of Acherim. Whereas Rav Menashe Bar Gada, who said that there is no issue of yados, now we might think that he, the same way the first opinion lines up with Acherim, that there's yados, we would think that Rav Menashe lines up with the Tanakama, which says there is no issue of yados. But truth be told, Amar Lak Rav Menashe, de Kule Alma Sabri Hakotzer Schach in Lo Yados. Even Acherim, who says that there is yados, would generally agree that there's no issue of yados when you cut initially for the purpose of covering your sukkah. But what's this whole machlokes of the Tanakama and Acherim? Where you initially cut the sheaves of grain to use it for food, for consumption. So it's initially going to be makabel tuma, but then you withdrew, you went back, and you say, you know what? Actually, these would make much better skach than food. So they're machlokes. So this is what Ramesh is basically what he could be saying. In general, when you cut grain in the field, no issue of yados if you're intending to use it for skach. But if your initial intention was to use it for food, that's when we have the machlokes, the Tanakama, and Acherim, if you can go back and reclassify it as non-food and thereby obviating the issue of yados. That is the first suggestion that the Gemara makes. However, if this is true, if it's true that you initially cut it for the purpose of food, it's such a compelling point that the Acherim have. How can you just simply go back and reclassify something so flippantly? What's the position of the Chachamim that there wouldn't be an issue of yados here? So Now, if you want to say that, maybe according to Chacham, all you do is just in your mind say, you know what, you meditate for a moment and you use your mental energy and you say, I'm going to use the force and I'm going to turn this thing back into non-food. But mi batale machshava bahachi is simply using thought enough. It's interesting, by the way. There's a similar discussion about muksa on Shabbos. Generally, a rock is by default muksa machas gufa. It's automatically muksa. So let's say I want to put rocks aside on Shabbos, not to throw out cars coming by or anything, right? Just for whatever reason, I want to use it as a door stopper. So it's enough before Shabbos for me to think in my mind, okay, this rock over here has a purpose on Shabbos. Or do I have to actually maybe take the rock and physically put it aside in order to do something that's tangible? So similar kind of discussion over there. Vatnan, so we see in the Mishnah that machshava, that thought, is not sufficient to reclassify something's status. It says, Kol hakelim yordin le'tumah machshava. Now, vessels can be rendered tameh through machshava. But if you want to revert them back to not being tameh, you need to do something actually active and physical. So the rule is Maisa motzim yad maisa miyad machshava. An action can undo an action or a thought. Machshava ina motzia lo miyad maisa lo miyad machshava. However, a thought is not sufficient to undo an action, and it's not even sufficient to undo a machshava itself. So, still, this is the long-winded question I was warning you about. Still building up the question. V'chi tema hani mili kelem dekashivi aviyosar chachila ninu machshava naisa machshava salka. Now, you might think that reject this Mishnah because this Mishnah is saying for a kli. Now, a kli is something that's supposed to be more permanent. So, for something more permanent like that, you can't just simply reclassify with your thought. Now, but maybe you would think to say that you could reclassify food, which is a little bit more temporal. But that's not a good distinction. Why? Because we see in the Mishnah, Kol yodas ha'ochlin shabsasim begoren taharos yosim tame. So we say that something needs to be, we'll translate as crushed for now. In the goren, if you crush it, and then you can reclassify it as tahor. If the word bisasan means all you do is undo the binding of it together, you don't have to really do a real action, then we have a good proof that you can reclassify something without doing a real maisa to it. That you literally have to do a maisa and crush it. It sounds like even when it comes to food, you need to do a maisa to reclassify it. So all of this is to ask the following question: how can we say the Ramanasha would portray the machlokis, the chachamim and acherim, as in a case where someone changed their mind? It would seem that changing your mind to switch something from food to schach is not sufficient. That's essentially the question. Machshava, thought, is not enough. So there's something wrong over here. Okay, so the Gemara says, Hachinami shabsasan mamish. The case, the way what Rav Menashe would tell you is that the machlokis, the chachamim, and acherim is when you not only withdrew mentally, but physically you did something to change it as well. That's when you can revert it from food to schach. But here's the problem. Now we kind of shifted the scale to the other side. Now the shita, the chachamim, is very compelling. The chachamim, this bug is attacking me here. The shita chachamim, that there's no issue of yados, is because you can do an action to change its status. That's such a compelling position. Now, before I had issues making sense of the Rabbanan, now how to make sense of acherim? Because acherim is saying is that yados will persist to be an issue even if you do an action to reclassify it. But I would think, it seems from the Mishnah, doing a maisa could undo a maisa or machshava. So what's the position of acherim? That there would be an issue of yados nonetheless. So as we're approaching the end of the Gemara, to Amri Rav Yossi, so maybe the acherim is similar to the position of Rav Yossi Ditnan, Rav Yossi Mitame. So we taught that Rav Yossi's, as we just taught in the in the the Mishnah that we quoted, that Rav Yossi holds that even if you do a Maisa, it's still going to be tummy nonetheless. But here's the problem. Hi, Mai. Bishlama Hasan, time to Rav Yossi Chazi. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Amar Shimon ben Lakish, Basar. What's the reason Rav Yossi held that you can't undo the status of those sheaves? It's because you could still use them, that when you want to, do the winnowing and stuff, you could use the pitchfork to flip them up into the air. So the stalks actually have a function that can't be ignored. That's why they're going to remain yados nonetheless. But here, in the case of schach, what are these sheaves going to be doing? So because when you're taking down the sukkah, you're going to want to use it in order to to hold on to. So the point being is, let's take a deep breath and zoom out for a moment. So in the end of the day, Rav Menashe was the one who said that there's no issue of yados for the sheaves of ears of grain that you're putting on your sukkah. There seems to be a machlokis, the chachamim and acherim, whether there is an issue of yados. So what's Rav Menashe doing? Is he taking a side of machlokis tanaim? So Rav Menashe would tell you in the end of the day is, no. When you initially use it for schach, there's no issue of yados. But when you initially intend for it for food, so then there's a machlokis that if you do an action to it, and you hit an imuchon mazumun, and you crush it, and you do an action to it, would that be able to change its status from food to using for schach? So that would be the machlokis, the chachamim and acherim in that machlokis that we quoted in that Mishnah there. That is the Gemara. I'll take my deep breath in. So I hope I explained things relatively clearly. It's a very long-winded Gemara, but I obviously shouldn't make any excuses. Is there anything that I can address or help clarify?
Yeah, I have a problem with the whole discussion. It would seem to me that the ears of grain are inherently food under any circumstance, and your intent or lack of intent to use it as food doesn't change the fact that it is food.
Interesting point. You're saying something categorically is food. Yeah. It's a good point. It's a good point. Something could be categorically food, and you shouldn't be able to change that, even if initially you're using it for the purpose of schach. It's a good point. Yeah, I hear the svar.
And then if you use it for schach, and after Sukkot is over, you say, "Hey, I got this stuff there, and I can eat it." Can't you eat it?
I see what you're saying. What you're saying is, okay, I see what you're saying. I think in the end of the day, right.
Is it really edible in that form?
You're saying in the grain form, it's not edible yet. Maybe that's the svar there. But we use it. We in the same list we have grapes in there. Grapes you could just eat right off the vine. That's a good point. All right, I'll have to look. I'm sure there's something obvious that I'm missing but I should look into that. That's a good point, Sadie.
People do toast grain and eat it toasted. I don't know any reason why you couldn't physically eat it right off the stalk.
That's a good point.
And by the way, you can't eat grapes that aren't ripe either.
Yes, I mean if they're ripe, but you don't need to like do any processing to them to make them edible. Yeah, it's a good point. Let me look that one up. I'm sure there's an obvious answer that I'm just not thinking of, that maybe I misunderstood something. All right, very good. Because the Gemara was extremely long-winded, I didn't want to do much on top of that, because I said if we get the Gemara, it's one of those. I get the Gemara, it's fine. But Zadie, let me look into your question, and God willing, we could open up with that next time once I get the answer. All right?
Your issue is grapes.
Was it, Judge?
Your issue is grapes only. Grapes will turn into raisins. It's a different food.
Oh, interesting. but they're edible themselves. So, I mean,
Not when they're
But they're
sour
changing
grapes.
into something else.
Here's the thing. The Chachamim, you just remember the Chachamim said,
Can't hear you.
according to Chachamim, there's no. So here's what the debate is about. The debate is about whether there's yados or not. So sorry, you know what? I got your question. I got what where the lack of clarity was. If we go back to the machlokas in Gimel and Beis, the machlokas is between the Chachamim and between the Chachamim and between Acherim is not about whether the grapes are food or whether the ears of grain are food. The question is whether the stem that is connected to it has the status of yados for tuma. So I think as long as you are planning on using this for food purposes, that's when it's going to have an issue of yados. But even according to the Chachamim, if you want to use these stalks for the purpose of schach and sukkahs, you would still need more of the actual shaft to outnumber the ears of grain. Because you're right, Zadie, the ears of grain are categorically food, and they still need to be batul barov. That hasn't changed. The only question is whether there's an issue of yados for the stems and vines that are attached directly to the food. If they also are an issue, and I believe that is contingent on whether we are using it for the purpose of food or not. That's the question. You are correct. The food part is categorically food. I got what you were saying. Does that make sense? Does that address your point?
Not quite, because again, if it's pasul because you intend to use it as food, but it's not pasul if you don't intend to use it for food.
No, the food part is going to be
still inherently food.
So the food part, the grapes,
so that then you
grain,
shouldn't be able to use it with an intent not to use it for food, because your mental state doesn't change what it physically is.
Correct. So the food part, the ears of grain, the grapes, the dates, they are inherently, categorically, fundamentally food, and that doesn't change. And that's why you need more vines and more stalk that constitutes the majority of the schach. But then the only question that we have is the immediate stem and that part that's attached to the food, do we classify that as yados of the food to the degree that you now need more vine and stalk to outdo the stems in addition to the food part itself? That's what we're trying to figure out. But the food remains food, and it still needs to constitute the minority of what's covering your schach. Okay, very good. So I'm glad we clarified that point. And next week we shift to 7:30 because mincha I think is like either 6:55 or 7, and mincha marav generally takes 25 minutes. And so anyone who's here for mincha marav, you can even just join me right here in Daf Yomi room if you want to be here in person. All right, wishing everyone a wonderful Shabbos, and God willing, see you soon. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you.